So now we're going to talk about how the mind works in terms of our memory. How does the mind work? How do we learn information and retain it? And how come we can't retain certain types of information? Is this on purpose? Why is the brain doing this? So we're going to look at this idea of how the mind works. Now, what happens is, briefly, is the information comes in through your sensory input, and we call it sometimes a sensory register or your sensory memory, and it's got all this stimuli and stimulus and all these things that stimulate our brain coming into through our senses, through our smell, taste, hearing, and seeing, of course, and it's got to filter this. If the brain takes in all the information that it sees and tries to retain it into the short-term and then long-term memory, it's going to actually probably cause a lot of issues. It'll be hard for us to focus, and we won't be able to pay attention and focus on one task at a time. So it's got to filter through and make decisions about what's the important things to bring in and what are not the important things. Then it's going to go to the short-term memory, and what happens is the short-term memory is going to look at that information, and it's going to filter things and say, look, again, we're going to have to forget some of this information, and unless you start rehearsing it or doing something with the information, you're probably going to drop it because your short-term memory can only take a little bit. We're going to see how much, a few bits of information at a time. And if it were to bring too much stuff in, that could be sensory overload as well. So the short-term memory is going to filter, and it finally goes to the long-term memory. Now we'll find out when it gets to the long-term memory, it actually could really stay there for a very long time. And actually, it may be able to stay there forever. The problem is going to be retrieval. How do we retrieve that information? So I think you'll hear a lot of people, when we've talked about like Carol Dweck and this idea of growth mindset, and you'll hear people say, oh, there's smart and there's dumb people. Well, we're going to find out there might be people that biologically, they have a little bit of advantage when it comes to memorizing information. However, we're going to find out that remembering and learning information through devices such like mnemonic devices and rehearsal can really help you learn something. So even though I might feel like I'm not the smartest kid on the block or I'm the smartest teacher, I can learn things, and by rehearsing it, I can start storing it in my long-term memory. And we looked at a video where we talked about the memory palace, where you have to imagine yourself, close your eyes and imagine yourself walking down the street, interacting with information that you already have in your long-term memory. So if you have a love and a passion for some kind of rap music or rock and roll musician like Kendrick Lamar or the Red Hot Chili Peppers or something, maybe you could use like imagery from the Red Hot Chili Peppers and connect it with something you're trying to learn in class, something in psychology, for example. So that is helping you with what's called a memory palace, teaching you ways that you can actually learn how to memorize quite a bit of information. It just takes a lot of practice and focus. Now, as you can see at the bottom left-hand corner, we have an image of the brain. And most short-term memory happens in the prefrontal lobe, which is the front part of the brain. It doesn't happen in the brain stem, which is the bottom with the stem, and it stays in the prefrontal lobe. So you have short-term and long-term memory, usually in the front of the brain. So when people have strokes, or they have traumatic brain damage, it could actually damage the short-term memory or the long-term, but more likely it's the short-term. So, for example, my father had a stroke, and he could remember things like getting on a raft in the Hudson River when he was a kid growing up in New York and tell us the story. But then we would say, Dad, what did you have for breakfast? He's like, I don't know. He couldn't remember things in the short term. And we talked about the patient of H&M. H.M. was this famous man who had really taught us quite a bit about and helped us understand how the brain works, because he had damage to the brain. So we could observe it and learn from him. And now we can actually see with MRIs and EEGs like how the brain waves work and what's happening in the brain. All right, so let's start off with the first part of the brain, which is your sensory memory. Now, sensory memory is the shortest term element of memory. Is the ability to retain impressions of original stimuli. So you can see the chart in the top right. You've got all the stimulus coming in. And I mean, you have a lot of things stimulating you. You have light, touch, smell, feel, shapes are coming at you, colors you're trying to process, vocabulary and words, sounds, you have smells, all this stuff is coming into your brain. And if it takes it all at once, it'll be like, ah, and you won't be able to do anything. So your sensory memory and your sensory register have to decide what to pay attention to. And they have to tell your short-term memory what's actually important. Now, sensory memory filters out large amounts of unimportant information received through the five senses. So it's efficient. And I'm sure you guys have heard, like, maybe people are very, very intelligent. They might have too much stimuli. They have a lot of things coming in. Or if somebody is getting stimulated too easy, especially children, while their brain is developing and they're very young, it's very hard for them. It's very common for them to have sensory motor issues where it's hard for them to like tie shoes and pay attention to things. And it's just their brain hasn't really completely learned what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. And also in psychology, by understanding what your brain is going to look for example, visuals tend to be very strong. Smell is very strong with the brain. That can also help us learn how to remember things. So I'm sure you guys have heard that, oh, some people are visual learners. Well, that may be true, but almost everybody is a visual learner. So anytime we can show you something and make it more concrete, it's going to help you learn something or remember something if you can picture it. So that's maybe why like videos and movies are so popular, and they grab our attention so quickly. Now your sensory memory has the five senses, and you can kind of see them. So you've got your iconic or sight, which it takes about half a second. You only get about half a second for that to get passed on to your short-term memory. So the receptors are bringing in your sight, and only half a second. Some stuff's going to stay, other stuff's not. So for example, if you're looking at in my room and we're learning about psychology, you're probably not necessarily sitting there paying attention to the color of the back of the chalkboard, or you're paying attention to the color of the desks or the shape of the fan. However, you're probably zeroed in on, hopefully you're focused on what I'm showing you, the words and the images that we're looking at right now when we learn about sensory motor. So you're starting to block out other images, even though your eyes can see them, and zeroing in and focusing in on the big idea, what we want you to what your brain wants to focus in on. And that, in this case, is we're trying to get you to pay attention to memory, how we learn about memory. You have iconic or hearing. Now, with hearing, you have 3 to 4 seconds. 3 to 4 seconds to try to hear something and try to get it to pass on to your short-term memory. Gets into your sensory, and then you pass it on quickly. So hearing, you got a little bit more time versus visual. So if you look at something and turn away within a half a second, and try to imagine that or put that into your brain, it's going to be more challenging. If you hear something for 3 or 4 seconds, then maybe you can retain that sound a little bit better. Now, you have smell, which is very strong. People talk about how they can smell a perfume that their grandmother or their mother wore 30 years after they pass away, and it reminds them of their mother. So it brings back those memories. And smell is very powerful. And remember, taste, most of your taste is your smell. So smell is a strong way, and you'll pick up on smell. And also there's in evolutionary psychology, we think that smell has some real purpose in terms of attracting mates. So for example, males and females release different pheromones through their armpits and their sweat that attracts other mates. And we find out that certain males and certain females tend to be more attracted to other males and females. They've even done experiments with diet and smell. So people that tend to eat vegetables and eat a healthier diet, overall, they tend to be more attractive in smell to females, for example, than men that eat lots of meat, lots of fatty meats. And that might make sense. Logically speaking, if somebody eats very healthy, they might live longer, and that might be a better mate than somebody eats unhealthy. Taste. You taste something and you try to pass that on to your memory. I'll never forget that taste. And that might be a little bit harder, but at the same time, again, I'm sure you guys have had something that like your grandma or your mom made that maybe today you've gone someplace you'd be like, oh my gosh, that tastes exactly like my grandmother's pudding, or that tastes like my mother's famous lasagna. Well, so you can pick out some of those tastes and those with your buds and your memory, and it can come back from your long term memory. Touch, understand if something's rough or hard. You feel that through your senses, but can you retain that to your short term and then to your long term memory? How does something feel? Well, I know that those are rocks are kind of smooth and hard, but and then I look at plastic, it can be very smooth. But then I look at sand, and it's kind of gravelly and kind of thin, and I can feel it. Or I could feel the seashell on the beach when I went on vacation. So these ideas come back from your long-term memory. Now here you go. Here's your short-term memory, and then you can see your senses. You get short-term memory is in the front, the frontal lobe. Touch is actually more towards the middle of the brain, and then your hearing is on the side above the ears. And sight is actually at the back of the brain. That's why you ever heard somebody say, oh, don't hit somebody and smack somebody in the back of the head. They could get their eyes stuck. Maybe that's true. But what you're doing is you could actually damage the sight processing of somebody because the sight is being processed all the way at the back of the brain. Now, short-term or working-term memory holds information for just long enough for it to be used and then discarded. Okay? So your short-term memory, once it gets to the sensory register and your sensory memory, it goes to your short-term memory. And short-term memory's got to make some quick decisions here. How long and how much of this stuff are we passing on to the long-term memory? And if this stuff is not valuable, it's got to go because the brain's going to get overloaded or overstimulated. And to hold on to information long enough to process it to the long-term memory. And you can kind of see below, you have your sensory organs, your hearing, smelling, touching, feeling. And you've got sensory memory, we said, is maybe like half a second to see something and maybe a couple seconds to hear something. But once it gets to the short-term memory, you have actually it says less than a minute, you have below a minute. Below a minute. So what you want to do, it's in your short-term memory, you want to start saying it again. That's why, for example, when I make these ed puzzles for you guys, yes, we're learning about it, we're talking about it in class, and I'll talk about it several times in the class. However, by you watching this ed puzzle again, it actually could help you bring back and rehearse that information in your long-term memory so that you could actually apply it to a test or in real life. You might walk around and be like, well, actually, that's because your short-term memory is forgetting this, and it could actually improve your ability to memorize things that you learn about your memory. And studies have shown that learning about this stuff is very profound. Now, short-term memory will only hold information for about 30 seconds max if the information is not rehearsed. So you got to rehearse it. 314. So if you say a phone number, for example, 314-586-721. 314-586-721. Sorry, 314-722. Oh no, I forgot. The bell threw me off. I couldn't remember. So you got to rehearse. You got to keep talking and keep saying these ideas in the short-term memory so you can get it over to that long-term memory. And I really like this imagery. You have a bucket with holes in it, right? And the water is pouring out. Now, let's pretend that's your short-term memory. And the water is information. The information is pouring out of your brain very, very quickly. If you don't get that into the long-term memory, that's all that's going to be left. So if you imagine how fast the water's coming out of that bucket, you're not going to have much left that actually gets passed on to the long-term memory because of the time. Now, actually, what we found out with the study of H&M had really opened the door for us is that short-term memory can only hold about 7 bits plus or minus 5 bits of information at a time. And we saw in the video that actually the researchers maybe even showing it could be less. It could be more like 5 bits of information when we actually look at the brain. So it's not a coincidence, for example, when we talk about phone numbers. Your phone numbers tend to be 314, which is the area code, or 636, which is the area code. That's the extra 3, but your immediate phone number will be like 846-7871. It'll be 7 bits of information. And they'll go up 3 more, which is going past that. But when the telephone companies made phone numbers, they based it on memory psychology. and actually said, look, most people can only remember up to 9 numbers. Some people can only do 5. And that's why phone numbers are actually 7 numbers long still today. It's funny because a lot of you guys probably don't have to remember phone numbers today. So we're going to go more into short-term and long-term memory in the next video.